Have you ever noticed how those who are spiritually awake often feel a strange unease with their own thoughts? How the very mind that carries them through life can also become a source of fear, of doubt, of restlessness. And you might wonder, if awakening brings clarity, if spiritual growth brings peace, why would awareness of one's own mind feel so frightening, so unsettling? But what if I told you this fear is not a flaw? What if it is not a sign of weakness, but a mirror reflecting something deeper within you? The mind, with its endless chatter, its ceaseless questioning, its relentless pursuit of answers, can feel like a storm you cannot escape. And the spiritually awake, sensitive as they are, sense the vastness of this storm. They sense its power, its unpredictability, its capacity to overwhelm. And in that sensing, they pause, hesitate, even recoil. Because the awakened mind sees more. It sees patterns, connections, illusions. It confronts truths that ordinary perception ignores. And in confronting these truths, in seeing the depths of one's own consciousness, a fear arises not of the world, not of others, but of the vast, untamed wilderness within. This is the hidden challenge of awakening. The mind itself becomes both teacher and test, mirror and mystery, guide and shadow. When you are spiritually awake, the mind is no longer just a tool, it becomes a mirror. It reflects not only what is around you, but what is within. And this reflection can be terrifying. For most people, the mind is background noise, a companion they scarcely notice. But for the awakened, sensitive, aware, it is a storm, a vast, endless landscape of thoughts, memories, fears, desires, and unspoken questions. And the first encounter with this storm is often startling. Imagine standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into a churning sea. You see waves rising and falling, currents moving in directions you cannot control. That is your mind. And the spiritually awake, standing on this cliff of awareness, can sense the vastness beneath. They feel the pull of every thought, the weight of every memory, the force of every fear. And in that moment, many hesitate, many step back, because the mind is not predictable. It is wild, untamed, and aware of its own power. And yet, fear is not inherently negative. It is the mind's way of showing you boundaries, of revealing the edges of consciousness, of alerting you to areas yet unexplored. The spiritually awake fear not the world around them, but the world within the infinite depths of thought, reflection, and memory. They sense that to dive too quickly without understanding can be disorienting, even overwhelming. And so the mind becomes both guide and gauntlet, teacher and trial. Consider the patterns the mind creates. Thoughts rise, demanding attention, spinning scenarios, crafting stories, replaying conversations long past, imagining futures that may never arrive. And in this ceaseless motion, the awakened witness begins to feel vertigo. For the first time, they see how much of their life has been structured by thought, by mental constructs, by the ceaseless urge to analyze, to control, to predict. And in this awareness, the mind appears simultaneously familiar and alien, comforting and threatening. This fear, subtle yet persistent, is a signal. It is the mind pointing to its own complexity, to the hidden corners of consciousness that have long been ignored. The spiritually awake realize that most of life has been spent avoiding these corners, hiding from the truth that lie beneath surface thoughts. And now, awakened as they are called to face them, to sit with them, to witness the mind in its raw, unfiltered state. And yet there is a delicate paradox here. The mind in its power and unpredictability is also the key to awakening. It is the instrument through which insight, clarity, and transformation emerge. But the first step in wielding this instrument is recognition, recognizing that the mind is not the enemy, nor is it inherently safe. It is both vast and intimate, chaotic and revealing. And in recognizing this, the spiritually awake learn the first lesson. Courage is not absence of fear, but presence within it. The mind mirrors everything we have resisted. Our anger, our grief, our insecurities, our illusions. And when you face this mirror without flinching, something extraordinary happens. You begin to see the roots of your fear. You see the origins of patterns you thought were unchangeable. You see the very conditioning that has shaped your life. And in seeing, you gain the first taste of freedom, not freedom from thought, but freedom within it. Imagine for a moment a traveler entering a dense forest at dusk. Every shadow, every rustle, every whisper of wind seems threatening. The mind is that forest, and for the spiritually awake, the shadows are amplified. Memories rise like trees, fears stalk like hidden animals, doubts drift like fog. But as the traveler learns to walk with awareness, to notice without panic, to move deliberately, yet without resistance, the forest transforms. The shadows remain, but they are no longer enemies. They become guides, revealing hidden paths, teaching lessons that could not be learned in the open sunlight of comfort. And so the spiritually awake develop a kind of relationship with their own mind. Not a relationship of control, nor of denial, but of observation and understanding. They notice the thoughts that arise, the fears that surface, the stories the mind tells, and slowly, gradually, the storm loses its tyranny. The waves remain, but they are no longer overwhelming. The currents continue, but they are navigable, and the cliff-edge perspective, once dizzying, becomes empowering. And here is the deeper truth. The fear of the mind is really fear of truth. Not the truth of the world, not the truth of others, but the truth of yourself. For most of life we live in distraction, in avoidance, in narratives carefully constructed to protect ourselves from seeing clearly. And awakening strips these protections away. The spiritually awake encounter the mind as it truly is, raw, reflective, unrelenting. And in that encounter, fear arises naturally, inevitably, and profoundly. And yet this fear is also a doorway. It is the point at which the ordinary ceases to suffice, and the extraordinary begins. It is the moment when the spiritually awake are called to step beyond comfort, beyond certainty, beyond superficial understanding, into the depth of consciousness itself. The mind in all its chaos becomes a teacher, guiding not with gentleness, but with challenge, not with comfort, but with clarity. And so the first part of this journey is clear: recognition and presence. Recognize the mind's power. Recognize its unpredictability. Recognize the fear that arises not as weakness, but as insight. And in this recognition, begin to cultivate presence, the awareness that watches without being consumed, that observes without needing to control, that sees without fleeing. For the spiritually awake, fear of the mind is not a failure. It is a signal, a guidepost, a reminder that the path to awakening is not linear and not easy. It is a journey into the vast, intricate, mysterious depths of consciousness itself. And the first step on this journey is to stop running, to stop resisting, to stop believing that fear is something to be eliminated. Instead, see it as a teacher, as a mirror, as the entrance to clarity, to insight, to freedom. And in this first step, something remarkable happens. The mind begins to show its purpose. It is not a prison. It is not a tyrant. It is a reflection, a guide, a mirror that, when faced with courage and presence, reveals the truth of who you are, who you have been, and who you are capable of becoming. The spiritually awake have often noticed a curious paradox. The mind, the very instrument that allows thought, reflection, and insight, also becomes the source of unease. It whispers, it questions, it loops, it doubts. And in those moments the awakened soul feels a strange fear, not of the world, not of circumstance, but of the mind itself. It is as if the mirror of consciousness has become so clear, so revealing, that what stares back is both unfamiliar and profound. And what is it that the mind reveals? It reveals the depth of your attachments, the weight of your expectations, the subtle fears you have carried without acknowledgement. Every recurring thought, every anxious scenario, every mental story is not random. It is a map, a reflection of what you have not yet integrated, what you have not yet accepted, what you have not yet faced. The fear arises because the awakened recognize the truth in these patterns. They see the threads connecting past wounds, present anxieties, and imagined futures. They realize how much of life has been unconsciously shaped by the mind's compulsions. Consider the mind as a vast, untamed river. Most people float downstream, carried by its current, without noticing the flow. But the spiritually awake stand at the edge, observing, aware of every twist and turn. And in this awareness they also notice the turbulence, the rocks, the whirlpools, the sudden rapids. That turbulence is the fear of the mind, the natural response to the vast, uncharted depths of one's own consciousness. And yet this turbulence is not enemy. It is guide. It shows where resistance exists, where clarity has not yet reached, where integration is needed. The mind is also a storyteller. It weaves narratives of inadequacy, of judgment, of imagined catastrophes. And for the spiritually awake, these stories are often amplified. They are aware of the fragility beneath the surface of thought, the way illusions cling, the way identity is entangled in mental constructs. And in witnessing this, fear naturally arises. The mind feels unpredictable, untamable, and even dangerous. But herein lies the lesson. Fear of the mind is not a flaw, it is a signpost toward awakening. Imagine a forest at night. The trees are dense, shadows obscure the path, every rustle feels like a threat. That is the mind, and the spiritually awake, standing at the edge, must learn to walk through it, not with avoidance, but with awareness. Every fear, every anxious thought, every compulsive scenario becomes a stepping stone, a guide, a marker revealing the terrain of consciousness. And the more you walk this path, the more the forest transforms. Shadows are no longer terrifying. They are teachers, showing the contours of the mind and the depth of your own awareness. And here is the subtlety. The mind in all its activity is also a reflection of life itself. It mirrors not just your inner patterns, but the structures, expectations, and pressures of the outer world. The fear you feel is often fear of clarity, fear of seeing life as it truly is, without illusion. For most people, this clarity is frightening because it exposes vulnerability, imperfection, and uncertainty. But the spiritually awake do not turn away. They lean in. They observe. They recognize that the fear is the doorway to freedom, not a barrier to it. Overthinking, anxiety, and mental loops are the mind's language. And when the spiritually awake listen carefully, they begin to understand what the mind has been trying to show all along. The recurring thought about failure is not merely fear. It is a guide pointing to unhealed wounds. The obsession over control is not mere compulsion. It is a signal of where trust has been broken. The relentless imagining of what-ifs is not futility. It is an invitation to practice presence. In this way, fear becomes a teacher, the mind becomes a map, and awareness becomes the compass. And yet, learning to dance with the mind requires patience. It is not a confrontation to be won, nor a problem to be solved. It is a practice, a dialogue, a constant turning toward the present moment. The spiritually awake cultivate this through meditation, reflection, and mindful observation. They notice thoughts arising, allow them to exist without resistance, and gently return to the observer within. In this practice, the fear slowly loses its dominance. It transforms from a paralyzing force into a guide, revealing where growth is needed, where wisdom awaits, and where clarity can be found. Consider the analogy of a fire. The mind, unobserved, can feel like a wildfire, consuming everything in its path, leaving anxiety and confusion in its wake. But approached with awareness, it becomes a controlled flame. It illuminates, warms, and transforms. The spiritually awake learn to use this fire, to let it show the darkness, to allow it to burn away illusions without destroying presence. And in this way, fear becomes the fuel for awakening rather than an obstacle. And the profound insight emerges. The fear of the mind is ultimately fear of yourself. Fear of the truths you have hidden, the emotions you have resisted, the patterns you have unconsciously repeated. But the spiritually awake, aware of this, embrace the fear. They allow themselves to witness, to feel, to explore, to integrate. They see that the mind is not something to escape, but something to understand, to align with, to navigate consciously. And so the second part of this journey is clear. Embrace the mirror. Walk with the fire. Allow the mind to reveal what it must, without judgment, without resistance, without panic. For in this embrace, fear loses its tyranny, thought loses its dominance, and the awakened soul begins to discover the profound freedom that lies at the heart of consciousness itself. The mind once feared becomes a guide. The storm once terrifying becomes a teacher, and the spiritually awake learn a crucial truth. Fear is not the enemy, clarity is not an illusion, and the mind is not a prison. It is the path, the instrument, the mirror of awakening. Now, having observed the mind, having recognized its storms, its stories, its relentless spinning, the spiritually awake face the ultimate question. How do we move from fear to mastery, from anxiety to presence, from observation to integration? How do we allow the mind, once a source of terror, to become a guide, a mirror, a tool for awakening? The answer is simple, yet profound: presence. Not an idea, not a technique, not another thought to follow, but the lived experience of awareness. Presence is the state of returning again and again to the observer within. It is the recognition that the mind, with all its turbulence, is simply part of the landscape, not the landscape itself. It is the ability to notice thought without being consumed by it, to feel emotion without being overwhelmed, to experience life without needing to escape or control. Imagine standing at the edge of the storm. The wind howls, the waves crash, lightning splits the sky. This is the mind in overdrive. But when you plant your feet, breathe, and simply observe, the storm does not vanish. It rages, but you are no longer swept away. You are present. You are awake. You are aligned with the calm beneath the chaos. And in this calm, clarity emerges. And here is another truth. The mind fears itself because it senses depth it has never been asked to face. The spiritually awake see this depth, and initially it is frightening. But the depth is not to be feared, it is to be explored. Every anxious thought, every compulsive worry, every repetitive pattern is a doorway, a message, a clue to the truths buried within consciousness. And when approached with presence, these fears transform into teachers, revealing the self not as limited by thought, but as vast, unbounded, aware. Consider the metaphor of a sculptor working with stone. The mind, raw and untamed, is like a block of marble. At first it is chaotic, jagged, full of cracks and unpredictability. The spiritually awake, through patient observation, begin to chip away, to carve gently, to reveal the shape hidden within. Every fear confronted, every thought observed, every loop examined, becomes a stroke of the chisel. Slowly, steadily, the form of true awareness emerges. And here is the subtle irony. The more you master the mind, the less it feels like mastery. It is not about control. It is about cooperation, dialogue, understanding. The mind is no longer a tyrant, but a partner. It shows you patterns that require attention, illuminates shadows you have ignored, and guides you toward insights that cannot be accessed through force or resistance. And in this partnership, fear loses its power. It becomes a signal, a teacher, a companion on the path to awakening. And let us be clear, this process is not instantaneous. Overthinking will return, anxiety will rise. The mind will stir storms, as it always has. But each time you notice, each time you return to presence, each time you embrace the reflection without panic, you deepen your mastery. The fear itself becomes less frightening. The mind itself becomes less of a trap. And slowly you discover the extraordinary freedom that was always within you, waiting for recognition. The spiritually awake learn another lesson: compassion for self and for the mind. The thoughts that frighten you are not enemies. They are echoes of conditioning, remnants of fear, fragments of stories long held. And when approached with gentleness, patience, and understanding, these echoes cease to dominate. They are acknowledged, honored, and allowed to exist without consuming the observer. And in this gentle witnessing, the mind, once feared, becomes aligned with presence, clarity, and freedom. Now let us consider the mind as a mirror again. Every thought reflected, every fear revealed, every mental loop observed is a reflection of what lies within consciousness itself. The spiritually awake who have faced these reflections begin to see patterns with unprecedented clarity. They understand that fear is temporary, thought is not ultimate, and awareness is eternal. They recognize the power to choose where attention goes, the freedom to engage or release, the capacity to see the mind without being controlled by it. And here is the most profound insight. Awakening is not about eliminating fear, nor about silencing the mind. It is about transforming the relationship with both. The spiritually awake discover that freedom is not absence of thought, nor absence of fear. It is the presence that perceives both, integrates both, and remains anchored in awareness. The mind becomes a guide, the fear becomes a teacher, and consciousness itself becomes the home in which you live fully, freely, awake. Consider the analogy of a river once more. The river of thought rushes, churns, overflows. The spiritually awake learn to navigate its currents, not by damming it, not by forcing it, but by floating with awareness. Each rapid becomes an opportunity to practice presence. Each whirlpool becomes a lesson in letting go. And over time, the river, once chaotic and terrifying, becomes a channel of insight, wisdom, and profound freedom. And finally, the culmination. The spiritually awake recognize that the mind is a reflection of life itself. The storms it creates, the fears it amplifies, the compulsions it produces, all are part of existence, all are part of consciousness. And when approached with presence, with courage, with patience, they reveal not limitation, but possibility, not danger, but freedom, not chaos, but clarity. And so the fear of the mind, once a hidden trap, transforms into a doorway to insight, to presence, to awakening. The spiritually awake, who once trembled before their own thoughts, now move through life with clarity, compassion, and profound awareness. The mind, no longer feared, becomes a companion on the path, a reflection of consciousness, a guide to what is real, enduring, and eternal. Because in the end, the spiritually awake realize a subtle truth. The mind is not to be feared. It is to be known. And when it is known, when it is observed, when it is integrated, the fear dissolves, and you awaken fully not to an absence of thought, but to the living, breathing, awake reality that is your true self. And in this awakening, life itself changes. Not because the world has altered, not because circumstances have shifted, but because the mirror of consciousness reflects a new clarity. The storms are still there, the waves still crash, but the awakened are anchored, grounded, aware. They move with the currents, guided by insight, illuminated by presence, free in a way that the unobservant mind can scarcely imagine. And so the spiritually awake no longer fear their own mind. They embrace it, dance with it, learn from it, and through it awaken fully not to escape thought, but to live harmoniously within it, fully present, fully aware, fully alive.